Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Off the Podium. And I am incredibly delighted this week to be joined by my all-time favorite principal flute of the LaGrange Symphony, Elisa Lyle. Elisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when I've had the pleasure of having one of our musicians on the show, it's always fun to start with, how did you come to choose the flute, or did it choose you?
Well, it's actually a little bit of a story that goes all different directions, but my grandmother was a fine pianist, and she actually played in the silent movie theaters way back. She was born in 1886, so we're very spread apart in our generations. And she had always inspired me. And so I started on piano early in elementary school because I wanted to be like grandma, because she was such a fine pianist, but also she played church piano. And I ended up doing okay, but it wasn't the love of my life. And then when I joined sixth grade band, I knew I wanted to play a woodwind, but my brother already played the saxophone. So I didn't want to play saxophone. So that left the flute or the clarinet, because the band directors back then didn't start double reeds, not at least not where I grew up.
Yeah.
And so I decided to go with the flute for probably just reasons, but there was so much flute on television in cartoons, and I don't know, I love when Arnaz would bring his dance band out, and the saxophones and their big ruffly shirts, they would put down their saxophones and whip out the flute, and I was so excited. Just silly things like that. Popeye, has a big piccolo part at the end, Looney Tunes, all kinds of things like that. It just spoke to me. There was popular music, Color My World. I know you remember that one. Contemporary Christian had a lot of flute in it at the time. This all during the 70s. So just a lot of reasons to think, I want to sound like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the flute is such a sort of characterful and sparkly sound. And of course, its baby brother, the piccolo, even more so. I mean, there's nothing that can cut through an entire orchestra like the piccolo or the flute in the high register. So, and I think quite often the personality of somebody often matches the instrument that they choose so well. And I've always been struck ever since our first outing on the stage together 5-6 years ago, how you've got such a sparkling personality, and I can't imagine you playing anything else other than the flute. So to me, that's always been the perfect match for you.
Thank you. I do think it's a perfect match. I have occasionally put my toe in the pond of another instrument, but I always come back to the flute.
Yeah, no, understood. And of course, I was reminded the other day on a very well followed social media post that you also play the bagpipes, which I think you're the only person I know in my entire career who plays the bagpipes. So I'm terribly impressed. How did that come about?
Well, actually, that was an assigned instrument when I came basic training with the Air Force. I was on my way to an Air Force band, and a little bit different than the other military branches, because the other military branches, you normally go to a training school, but in the Air Force, they assume that you had already been to college and professional ready. So although I still had to go to basic training, that I got out and went to my first duty assignment, they handed me some bagpipes, and they said, this will be your secondary assignment, and you need to start practicing because you go on tour in 3 months. So I did.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I mean, for a start, I mean, I just can't imagine being handed an instrument that I'd never played before and told you've got to be able to play this in 3 months. But of all things, the bagpipes. I mean, that's an incredible story.
Well, it was very interesting, but in the military band, if you played a woodwind instrument in the concert band and in the marching band, your choices in the afternoon and they weren't really choices, they were assignments. But if you're a saxophone, obviously you'd be in the jazz band.
Uh-huh.
And then the rock band didn't have any woodwinds. So, and there was a Dixieland, so that played Dixieland band. But other than that, all the woodwinds went to the bagpipes. So
remarkable.
It's actually been a good skill to have, and I'm glad to have learned it, but I did not grow up listening to bagpipes. I'd never seen one in person until one was placed into my hands. I had seen them on the big St. Patrick's parades in New York and Boston, but that's all. And in the old Maid cards, I think it's a Barney the Bagpiper or something. So I've seen a kilt. But I was clueless, but it's a good fit for a woodwind player and somebody that can disassociate different parts of their head, because you don't breathe in rhythm.
Right. Yeah.
There's no articulation other than the grace notes, and it's different.
Yeah, no, I mean, the next time that we can be together in person before a rehearsal on stage or such, you've got to bring these and show me something about the bagpipes.
I will. You may find you have a natural talent for them. And the thing is, you don't practice all the time on the bagpipes. There's a little practice chair that almost looks like an oboe. Well, kind of a cross between an oboe and a recorder that's very quiet and only mildly irritating.
Terrific. Well, wonderful. That was a great tangent to sort of go down. But so sticking to kind of our talking points here, tell me a little bit about your training overall and the teachers that you've had or directors that have been influential in your life.
Well, I would say every director's been influential in some manner in my life. My first private flute instructor I didn't have until I started 10th grade, and my band director, Al Sergel, recommended her to me, and I'm so glad he did, because she smoothed my rough edges. I had a lot of desire, and I put hours and hours of practice in on my own, but until you have someone to guide you, that it can all be a little bit rough around the edges. And she instilled in me a love of, believe it or not, scales, etude study. She was really into Baroque music. We did a lot of Baroque music, but also a lot of flute, French conservatory pieces. And she was also a strong believer in doing recitals, even still in high school. So I did 2-hour-long recitals in high school with a provided accompanist and by memory.
Wow.
And it was, I jumped on board and we went, and I will forever appreciate her for that. And I only had her for 3 short years, but she was a wonderful teacher.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great story. I mean, yeah, I think it's just so important, no matter how much passion you have or however many hours you put into it on your own, you've got to have somebody to kind of show you the different pathways or just different ways of thinking about things. And I mean, I'm particularly struck by kind of the emphasis on recitals, particularly from memory, because I used to find those mildly terrifying. But yeah, I mean, there's simply no way to practice performance other than by performing. So you can spend all of that time in the practice room on your own, but there's no other way of practicing performance other than being on the stage in front of a live audience. And so those experiences, particularly that early on, I think, in solo recitals, not just sort of being in the middle of a band, for instance, are incredibly demanding, but also can be incredibly rewarding as well, as they clearly have been. So wow, that's remarkable. Again, I could never quite get past the fear of total memorization, and I would always psych myself out. So every time I thought things were going well, that's the point where things would come off the rails.
Because you were thinking too much while you were doing it.
That's right. It's like, it's going really, oh no, it's not.
I won't say that never happened to me because it has before, but muscle memory, it's very tempting to rely only on muscle memory after a while, but then you start second guessing yourself.
That's right. That's right. Well, but I think the discipline of all of those etudes or technical studies, as we might think of them for the benefit of our audience, and scales. I mean, that when you play those sort of electric kind of scales in pieces, that's very much muscle memory, because you're not thinking particularly at the speed that some of those things move for the very agile upper woodwinds. You can't be thinking every note for sure.
No.
So yeah, it's an amazing. I mean, it's got to be like like flying a 747. I mean, you've got all of these millions of things to think about and keep an eye on, but somehow you've got to bring it all together to just produce that one result.
I was going to mention, when you asked about my teachers, I started a master's degree at North Texas, and my private instructor was Dr. Karen Clardy, and we walked in to her for an hour lesson. You had to have your flute out, warmed up, tuned up. You walked in, didn't even say hello. Well, sometimes, but immediately went through this whole regime of all the scales, and she played with.
Wow.
So not only did you have to do them incredibly fast, but also in tune with her.
Yeah.
All the major, all three forms of the minor, all, way up into the stratosphere, all of them. And then a very difficult arpeggio series. And that was every single time. And I think to myself now, she did that all day, every day. I'm sure with undergraduate students as well as graduate students. And she was just a technical beast.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it clearly paid off wonderfully well, because I mean, you do have such a terrific technique that supports all of those, kind of raw, passionate musical ideas that you obviously had when you were much younger. And I can certainly say, in the relationship, from me as the conductor on the podium to having you in the orchestra in the many pieces that we've now played together, and most of them quite difficult. I mean, you are kind of faultlessly reliable, and yeah, I mean, and you can sense that. So there's just that wonderful sort of kind of trust and knowledge that's going to happen, kind of on the stage. And I think that rests on that foundation of sort of technical mastery that you obviously had kind of drilled into you, and you also readily took on board. And
it's true, because you have to give props to all the teachers that put up with me, because most people don't hone themselves to a certain level unless they have somebody else leading the way, encouraging along the way.
Yeah. No, for sure. Well, so we sort of touched on this a little, but I'm going to sort of zoom in now. So we have something of a similarity kind of in our musical heritage, I would say. So both my grandfather and my father were in the military bands, actually the army bands, kind of back in the UK. And I'm curious as to how your experience serving in the Air Force has really sort of shaped your approach either to music or to other things in your life. I mean, just that experience and the skills and the discipline that you would have picked up. How has that informed your playing?
Now that's a different kind of question. A good one though. I think that in a military band, or really in any military unit, you don't get an option of not showing up. And I don't just mean physically. I mean emotionally, just being ready to do the job, whatever the assigned job is. And so it's I don't want to say do or die, but there is a lot of discipline involved. Not that every musician has discipline. Every professional musician is disciplined to some point. And when I taught big groups of children, I would always say, please discipline yourself so I don't have to do it for you. But that's a different kind of discipline. It made me realize that I can do the job. It may seem insurmountable or overwhelming or too big of a sandwich, but one bite at a time kind of thing. And there's always a reward at the end. There's always the benefit just of feeling like I did a good job. And knowing that and that may not be what you were asking about the actual, when I was in active duty, I think one thing it did was let me know that I could play outside of a collegiate experience, because, you know, when you're going to university, you know that you're going to have your instrument to your mouth for hours and hours and hours and hours every single day. But most people, when they get out into the quote real world, don't really have as much time unless they're in a huge symphony full time, and that's their only job. Then most people don't have that time. But I spent 3 hours every morning rehearsing concert band with a short lunch, and 3 hours every afternoon rehearsing that bagpipe, and then going home in the evening and practicing. And we also had called copy staff back then. This was before all the Finale, I don't know what music writing program you used to use Finale to put notes on paper, but back then they had airmen, and the arranger, I guess the band arranger would give us, and we would go home, and it seemed like we'd write out parts, and we had to do the transpositions for the other instruments ourselves.
All right.
So I was just immersed in music. Yeah. Just solid. And we did tour a lot. And so I guess it showed me that even if you're not feeling well, even if it's not your happiest day, you can still go out there, and music can fix a lot of things. It certainly improves my mood.
Yeah, so I mean, just an incredible sort of saturation and immersion in music. Help me understand here a little. So, in terms of the function of the Air Force band that you played with, I mean, what did sort of a typical season or your month, year look like? I mean, so I hear lots and lots of practicing, but kind of what's the actual kind of performance connection or outreach? What kinds of audiences were you playing for?
Well, that actually changed from the time in the 80s when I was active duty, and then we went on a lot of tours, but we also played for a lot of generals, officer retirements, and change of command services. The bagpipes toured all over the United States. So a lot of, I guess, public affairs, maintaining good relations with the public, and letting them know that, the military was still out there, and we were not currently in a war at that time. And so kind of keeping alive I don't want to say camaraderie, but the feeling that we're here for you. And we recorded several records, and yet another job in the afternoon, I was in the PA department, and I would take all these addresses that people would just hand us at concerts, and I would mail records to them of the band. But that was active duty. Then I took a great big 13-year break in service, and I came back and was stationed at Dobbins up in Atlanta. And I was in the guard band, which is a part-time band. I joined in June 2001, and we all know what happened just a few months later. And so all of a sudden, with the United States in a war, then we were considered more military. So a lot more training, physical training. And that's when I actually deployed overseas to the war zone, was with the Guard band. And I was in a rock band. It was not the concert band. It was a 9-member rock band, 8 males and me. And we went to, we went to Qatar several times. That was our home tent. And we also went to Kuwait and Oman. And the place we stayed the longest, other than Qatar, was Djibouti, Africa. And the goal there, we played 4 concerts a day. And some of them were for the people stationed at that Marine base. But other times we went out into the city and to the schools and just saw an incredible, horrible level of poverty. But we would play at their schools and they would dance, and it was a different way of trying to show the people who that the Marines that were. We always went out with the Guard whenever we played, but they were there to protect them and to be their friends, not the other way around. So it's kind of a different way of fighting a war. But it was very interesting. And you had asked me one time before, like, what was one of my most interesting or memorable musical experiences. And it was there in Africa when we played at nighttime. We would play one last concert at 10 o'clock at night. And every night we would play a tap, an Amazing Grace, but also we played Rocky Top sometimes in our set. And there was a Marine contingent from Tennessee. And that's Rocky Top is kind of the Tennessee song, I guess. And he came up to me afterwards, and I always think about Marines being twice as tough as anyone else. And he was crying. That song meant so much to him, and he was so homesick. And I thought, this is why we're here. It's not the same just to listen to recorded music, to have a live person in front of you playing something that's meaningful to you. There's no equivalent, really.
Yeah.
I miss live music.
Yeah. as do we all, but that's an incredible story. And the outreach and the power, the connectivity of music in all of those different ways is incredibly striking, the way that you tell it. I mean, so we started out with the military bands basically touring the country in peacetime, and it's sort of like a great PR outreach and connecting with the public, and of course your patrons are basically the entire country in that sense, if not of many countries, but you're making that connection there, but then you're kind of bringing such a different presence and meaning during active service or when you're in conflict zones like that. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's nothing like the presence of live music that triggers those memories and those emotions to the people who are on the receiving end of that performance. But I would imagine that you would agree, because I find this all the time as well. In performance on the stage, it triggers all of that for me as well, which is sort of what powers a lot of the emotional heightening of the musicians on stage. And then there's that reciprocal relationship between the performers and the audience. And I think I mean, you've described some incredibly unique and meaningful circumstances there, but I would think that the same kind of reciprocal dynamics are are kind of why we do this, for instance, in LaGrange, and that's the energy that kind of flows back and forth between our audience and the orchestra. And yeah, I mean, boy, do we miss that, because we're kind of built and trained for that. Yeah. Really, really extraordinary, and you kind of wrapped up in an amazing way our other kind of like couple of questions there about the most memorable performances, and also what do you think you're doing kind of when you kind of are part of a performance presenting music to an audience. So yeah, absolutely stunning, absolutely stunning. Well, hopefully we will be back on that stage in the not too distant future. It looks as though there is a little light starting to show at the end of the tunnel here. But so Elisa, it's just been wonderful to catch up with you and be on the receiving end of your glittering, sparkling personality. I learned a whole bunch there that in 5 or 6 years of us knowing each other, I did not know. And that's the wonderful thing about these interviews.
It is.
So I thank you for joining me this afternoon, and to our audience listening in and watching, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week. Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you, Richard. Enjoyed it.